There are sounds a person never forgets. A funeral shovel hitting wet earth, a hospital monitor going flat, and the sound of your own granddaughter slapping you so hard that your body crashes into a marble fireplace in front of 34 silent guests. That sound still wakes me up at night. My name is Gabriella Dobson. I'm 75 years old, founder of printing company Elite Press Technologies, and until the night of my birthday dinner, I believed I knew everything about sacrifice, grief, and survival. I was wrong. Because nothing prepares you for the moment the child you raised from infancy, gave a top-notch education, and hired for a prestigious management position at your company will look at you with hatred, not love. The ballroom inside my estate glowed with candlelight that evening. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath chandeliers. A violin quartet played softly near the river windows. Senators, executives, editors, and longtime employees filled the room. Everyone important to my life sat at that table. And then Daisy arrived late, 43 minutes late. She entered wearing a silver silk gown I had bought for her in Milan. Diamonds glittered around her neck, also from me. Her husband Trevor followed behind her, looking tense, pale, exhausted. The moment I saw his face, my stomach tightened. Something was wrong. "Happy birthday," Daisy said flatly, barely brushing her cheek near mine. No hug, no warmth. I forced a smile. "Where's my grandson Martin?" "With the nanny," she answered dismissively before reaching for champagne. That hurt more than I expected, because Martin adored family dinners, but Daisy already looked irritated to even be there. As dinner continued, the tension worsened. Every compliment aimed at me seemed to sharpen something dark inside her. By her third glass of wine, I noticed her jaw clenching every time someone mentioned Elite Press Technologies. Then suddenly, clink, 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 Daisy tapped her fork against her glass and stood. The room fell silent. Trevor grabbed her wrist instantly. "Daisy, don't." She pulled away, hard. "I think," she announced loudly, "it's finally time for new leadership at Elite Press." A cold wave passed through the room. I slowly lowered my fork. Daisy smiled directly at the board members. "My grandmother built a good company, but she refuses to let go. Honestly, it's embarrassing watching a 75-year-old woman cling to power." Several guests gasped quietly. "Daisy," I warned softly, "sit down." Then she looked directly into my eyes and said the sentence that destroyed my heart. "You should have stepped aside years ago instead of acting like some dying queen." The room froze. I stared at the little girl I once held after nightmares and realized she was gone. "You ungrateful child," I whispered. Her face twisted instantly. Then, crack! Her hand slammed across my face so violently my body hit the marble fireplace edge before collapsing onto the hardwood floor. Pain exploded through my ribs. Someone screamed. A wine glass shattered. Blood filled my mouth, and as 34 horrified guests stared down at me, my granddaughter stood above me, breathing hard with pure hatred in her eyes. At 11:18 p.m., the last guest left my house. At 11:21, my attorney locked the front doors. And at 11:24, while blood was still drying on my blouse, I began dismantling my granddaughter's entire life. If you think revenge happens in anger, you're wrong. Real destruction happens quietly, with signatures, with contracts, with truths people were too arrogant to read. I sat at the head of my dining table, holding an ice pack against my ribs while attorney Mark Woods spread legal files across the polished wood. My accountant, Lily Porter, opened her laptop with trembling hands. Neither of them spoke for almost a minute. The silence felt heavier than the slap. Finally, Mark looked at me carefully. "Gabriella, once we start this, there's no undoing it." I lowered the ice pack slowly. There was no undoing it when she raised her hand against me. Even now, saying those words hurts, because part of me still saw Daisy as the 11-year-old girl who cried herself to sleep after the tragic death of my daughter and her husband in a car accident. But the woman standing over me tonight with hatred in her eyes, that was no child anymore. That was someone dangerous. Mark opened Daisy's executive contract from Elite Press Technologies, and then the collapse began. "Clause 14, he said quietly. "Immediate termination for violence, reputational damage, or abuse toward company ownership." Lily swallowed hard. There were 34 witnesses. "And video," I added. Dorothy had recorded the birthday toast on her phone. She captured everything: the slap, the fall, the blood. At 12:07 a.m., Daisy Widmore officially lost her position as Vice President of Elite Press Technologies. At 12:42, her corporate accounts were frozen. At 1:10, access to company vehicles was revoked. Then came the hardest document, the trust. The $2.7 million trust I created years earlier to secure Daisy's future. My hands shook as Mark placed the papers before me. Hidden deep inside the trust was one clause I prayed would never matter. Any confirmed act of elder abuse immediately voided all beneficiary rights. Mark looked me directly in the eyes. "Are you absolutely certain?" Tears burned behind mine. "No," I whispered honestly, "but she made this choice tonight." And then I signed. The sound of my pen touching paper felt like burying my daughter all over again. By 2:30 a.m., Daisy had lost everything she thought she owned. But the cruelest part? She still had no idea. And by sunrise, her phone would begin ringing. By 8:14 the next morning, Daisy's perfect life began collapsing, and by the end of the week, even her husband could no longer recognize the woman she had become. I was sitting alone in my kitchen when the first voicemail arrived. "Grandma, answer your phone." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "How badly are you hurt?" Just anger. Then another call, and another. By noon, there were 23 missed calls. At 12:47 p.m., Mark informed Elite Press Security that Daisy's executive access had been permanently revoked. At 1:06, she arrived at headquarters. I know exactly what happened because 3 employees called me crying afterward. Daisy stormed through the marble lobby in sunglasses and heels, demanding everyone stop acting ridiculous. Then she slammed her keycard against the executive elevator scanner. Red light. Denied. Again? Denied. A young security manager named Carlos stepped forward nervously and said, "Miss Whitmore, I need you to leave the building." Daisy stared at him in disbelief. "Excuse me?" "Your employment was terminated this morning." Witnesses later said her face went completely white. "You can't fire me!" "You can't fire me! My grandmother built this company for me." Carlos hesitated only a second. "No, ma'am," he answered quietly. "She built it." That sentence spread through the building by evening, and it destroyed Daisy faster than any legal document. At 3:20 p.m., her company Range Rover was flagged for repossession. At 5 p.m., the bank froze the trust accounts connected to her name. Then came the final blow. Daisy's husband, Trevor, found a notice about the need to repay the mortgage for the luxurious house in the amount of $720,000 within a week. He came to my estate that night alone. Rain soaked his coat as he stood trembling in my doorway. "She's falling apart," he whispered. I looked at him carefully. "And where were you when she struck me?" Trevor lowered his eyes. Then he said something that chilled me to my bones. "She hasn't been well for a long time." The room went silent. "She barely sleeps. Paranoia, screaming episodes, aggression. She thinks people are plotting against her." My chest tightened painfully. Suddenly, pieces began fitting together. The rage, the obsession, the hatred in her eyes. Trevor broke down crying in my living room. "I thought I could help her myself." "No," I whispered. "You hoped ignoring it would save you." 3 days later, Trevor left Daisy. 7 days after my birthday dinner, Daisy Whitmore had lost her career, her money, her home, husband, and finally, the illusion that life would always rescue her from herself. After the final shock of losing her home, job, and marriage, Daisy did not disappear into luxury or reinvention. There was nowhere left for her to fall except reality itself. Within weeks, the life she once considered temporary hardship became permanent. With no elite connections willing to defend her after the elite press scandal, Daisy quietly left the city. She moved to a small industrial town where no one knew her name. For the first time in her life, she was not vice president, not heiress, not Gabriella Dobson's granddaughter. She was just an employee. At a local printing shop called Riverbend Press, Daisy accepted a position that barely covered rent. The work was mechanical, repetitive, and invisible. Sorting paper orders, packing deliveries, cleaning ink rollers after hours. The same industry she once believed she owned now treated her like any other entry-level worker. At first, she resisted reality. She argued with supervisors. She claimed mistakes were beneath her level. But slowly, the consequences of her past caught up with her sharper than pride could defend. Sleep deprivation worsened. Episodes of paranoia returned. She began believing colleagues whispered about her, that customers recognized her from the scandal, that she was being judged even in silence. In several instances, she left work early shaking, convinced she was being watched. Her employer eventually insisted she seek help. That was the first time Daisy entered psychotherapy. The sessions were not immediate redemption. They were breakdowns in controlled rooms. At first, she blamed Gabriella. Then she blamed Trevor. Then the world. But therapy stripped each excuse away layer by layer until something unfamiliar appeared beneath it. Responsibility. For the first time, Daisy had no empire, no money, no voice of authority to hide behind. Only herself. And in that silence, she began, painfully, unevenly, to understand that what she once called control was actually dependency, entitlement, and fear of losing relevance in the shadow of Gabriella's legacy. 18 months passed before I heard from Daisy again. 18 months of silence. No screaming voicemails, no lawyers, no accusations, just silence so deep it almost convinced me I no longer had a granddaughter. Then, at 3:07 a.m. on a freezing February night, I heard the sound that changed everything. My mail slot opened downstairs. I don't know why I went to check it myself. Maybe grief never truly sleeps. Maybe grandmothers never stop hoping. I walked downstairs wrapped in a robe, my ribs aching from the old injury whenever winter settled into the house. On the marble floor near the front door lay a thick envelope covered in familiar handwriting. Daisy's. My hands trembled before I even opened it. Inside were 9 pages written front and back in tiny blue ink. No perfume, no manipulation, no excuses, just truth. I sat beside the fireplace and began reading. Grandma, I spent 18 months blaming you before I finally admitted the person who destroyed my life was me. I stopped breathing for a moment. Outside, snow tapped softly against the windows. Inside, my entire chest began to ache. Page after page, Daisy confessed everything she'd spent years hiding. The jealousy, the drinking, the resentment of living beneath my success, the panic attacks, the psychotic episodes Trevor tried to hide from everyone. Then came the sentence that shattered me completely. You loved me so much that I started believing your sacrifices were obligations instead of gifts. Tears blurred the page instantly. I pressed my hand against my mouth to stop the sob that escaped anyway, because suddenly I wasn't seeing the woman who slapped me. I was seeing the 11-year-old girl standing at her parents' funeral, clutching my hand so tightly her fingers turned white. At the end of page 9, Daisy wrote something that made me cry harder than the assault ever did. Martin asked me why great-grandma disappeared from our lives, and I realized I had stolen the best person he could have known. I fully understand that I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I'm not asking you to forgive me. No, I'm asking that you let your great-grandson Martin spend time with you. He misses you terribly. I broke then, completely. Not from anger, from mourning, for Sarah, for Martin, for the family we destroyed with pride and silence. At sunrise, I finally reached the last page. I don't deserve forgiveness, Daisy wrote. I only wanted you to know I finally understand what you carried from me all these years. At the bottom was one final sentence. One sentence written shakily, like her hand was trembling. You were never the burden, Grandma. I was. The first time Martin came back to my house, he stood silently at the front door, holding a crayon drawing against his chest. He had grown taller. That broke my heart immediately. Children keep growing even while families fall apart. I knelt slowly, despite the pain still living in my ribs. Hello, sweetheart. Martin stared at me for 2 long seconds before whispering, Mommy cries after she drops me off. The words hit harder than Daisy's slap ever did. Behind him, a black sedan waited at the curb. Daisy never stepped out. Not that day, not any after. That was the boundary I refused to move, because forgiveness and trust are not the same thing, and people destroy themselves confusing the two. Martin visited every Saturday after that. We baked cinnamon cookies, read adventure books near the fireplace, walked through the gardens Sarah once loved as a little girl. And every single week, Daisy remained inside that parked car at the end of the driveway, watching silently through the windshield, never approaching, never asking to come inside. Perhaps she finally understood what she had broken. One rainy afternoon, Martin looked up at me while coloring dinosaurs at the kitchen table. Great-grandma, are you mad at Mommy forever? I froze. Some questions from children cut straight through the soul. I brushed his hair gently behind his ear. No, sweetheart, I'm just protecting my heart. That night, after Martin left, I stood by the window watching Daisy's car disappear down the road. For one dangerous moment, I almost ran after her, almost opened the door again. But then I remembered the hatred in her eyes the night she struck me, and I finally understood something my own grandmother once said. Some people can return to your heart without returning to your table. So I forgave Daisy quietly, but I never invited her home again. And strangely enough, that was the first time in 2 years I slept peacefully.
Friends, what do you think of this story? Write your opinion in the comments. Would you like more stories? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button so you don't miss any videos. See you tomorrow.